Hey friends, my name is Cody Archer, and I want to welcome you to this week's Revive Live. We're so glad that you're joining us. Today I have Asher Intrater with me. Asher, thank you for having some time with me. You've had a couple big trips recently and lots going on, so I appreciate you taking time with me
Yeah,
today.
there's always a lot going on.
Yeah.
This week too was very special.
Yes. Well, hey, I want to remind you guys again that Asher wrote a book last year called Alignment, and we want to give it away free to you if you've not got it already. You can go to alignmentbook.org and download the free copy. And this book has really been spreading around the world. I think more than any other book that you've written, Asher.
Could be.
Yeah, the amount of excitement in translating this book, getting it spread into other languages, has just been amazing. So if you've not read this book, make sure that you go to alignmentbook.org, download this book, and there's great and deep revelation for this hour that we're living in right now. So go after that. Well, Asher, it's great again to have you. Today, you've been on a couple big trips, one to America. You were just in Egypt recently. You're connecting with a number of significant leaders from the Middle East. And there's a lot of things here that are connected to some of the prophecies in Isaiah 19. And I know that this subject has really been stirring and building in you. I know it's been something that's growing over the last decade, but I feel like in the last couple of years especially, there's like this J curve of unity and interest, and it's like prayers of so many are beginning to be fulfilled and answered. So share with us a little bit, what were you doing in your last trip, connecting, and then we'll go into what some of the things that God was showing you.
Well, it's really true what you're saying, that there's been actually a long history, much more than 10 years, really. For me, it started in 1979, so it's almost 40 years, but of meeting and building reconciliation and cooperation, even covenant with Arab believers around the world. But really, the last 3-4 years, it started to speed up, and this last year is just going, like you say, off the chart.
Yeah.
And the only thing I can think of with that is that Yeshua's disciples asked him, "Is this the time?" In other words, there are timings. The prophecies are universal, but there comes a time when they start to get fulfilled, and I think that's what's happening right now. Is the God's promises and destiny and prophecies for the Arab peoples in general, and among that, the relationship with us as Jewish believers this is just the time. So it's happening in almost a flood going on right now.
Yeah,
So
it's an amazing time to be alive. Also to
Yeah.
see some of this, such an ancient prophecy, written almost 3,000 years ago, and now we're beginning to see really the beginning stages of something that's going to go global.
Yeah. Well, I think it's also that, you read a verse of Scripture and it's kind of a nice idea and you get a revelation, but when it gets fulfilled, all of a sudden it's like it's exploding right in front of you. And so, we've had a series of meetings all through the several decades, but the last 2 years have been speeding up here in Israel, in Jerusalem, with Christian Arabs, former Muslim believers in Israel and the Palestinian territories. But then we've had meetings around the Middle East, even in Europe. We have to blur the details a little bit, because for our some of our Arab friends, if they live in a Muslim area, this can be very dangerous for them. And so more dangerous for them really than for us. So, but we've had a series of meetings, both America, here in Israel, in Europe, and even in a few places around in the Middle East. And just recently we were in Egypt. And so it's just been a tremendous blessing, breakthroughs happening spiritually in the relationship between Jews and Arabs that believe in Jesus together.
One of the things that you've shared from this last trip, which I feel like we should already be past this point, but you said for many of those leaders in Egypt, it was their first time meeting a Jewish believer from Israel.
Yes.
And it's like almost every trip that you come back, we hear that same story over and over. A new leader that's never had met a Messianic Jew, a believer in Yeshua, but that just keeps happening, and how that is impacting people in ways that we can't even imagine.
Right. So one of the things that we've seen, you mentioned Isaiah 19.
Yeah.
Isaiah 19 for many years has been kind of a theme verse for Arabs and Jews together, much the way for us in praying for evangelism in Israel, Romans 11:26, all Israel will be saved, that's our banner verse. But the banner verse for the relationship between Jews and Arabs has been this Isaiah 19. And we were just in a series of meetings, there's been a level of fulfillment of those. And I thought it would be good for us just to read that prophecy there.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Because actually the understanding that's been growing on my understanding, I used to hear people talk about Isaiah 19. I felt my understanding of it was pretty superficial, but it's just kind of exploding recently. So we're talking about the prophet Isaiah, chapter 19, the last 3 verses. Anyway, it says in verse 23, Bayomahu, on that day, which is interesting because it's speaking about a time. There's a specific time, and I think that time is now. Bayomahu tieh misila mi Mitzrayim Ashura, uva Ashur ba Mitzrayim, uMitzrayim ba Ashur, ve'avdu Mitzrayim et Ashur. And it says that there will be a highway in that day from Egypt to Assyria, and from Assyria into Egypt, and so on. So it talks about this idea of being a highway. And the highway goes from Egypt to Assyria, and of course, that highway runs through Israel.
Yeah.
Now, let's just give that a little historical context for a minute. That when Isaiah wrote, he's living in Israel, and to his northeast is this huge country. Assyria then was the world-dominating power. Maybe like similar to maybe like the United States or something today. That it was the leading power, and then to the southwest you had Egypt, and those two were in conflict, and Israel was in the middle of the two, and there was politics and war and prophecies and everything going on.
Sounds a little bit like today, also.
It hasn't. Well, in that sense, it hasn't changed that much, really. And so he's dealing with that, but I think what's happening to the prophet is he's saying, well, in all this bad politics, what's the purpose of God? And he kind of looks into the future and he says, wait a minute, one day there's going to be a good relationship between these 3 countries, because there has to be something good in God. And then we begin to realize that good relationship doesn't happen politically. It happens through the minority remnant of believers in each nation. They do it. Yes. And therefore, although there is a road, there is a highway. I mean, we're talking about commerce and politics and travel and military. But we're talking about a spiritual road, primarily of relationships, of building these relationships. And you can interpret that in many ways, but I like particularly between Jewish believers and then Arab believers and then international believers coming together.
Yeah, that's amazing.
So that highway, we really felt like, to tell you the truth, it's happened. Over this past year, it's been, in terms of when a highway opens, it just means you can make that, you can travel on it. It's there. It doesn't say how many people are going to, but the highway's open.
Yeah.
And so it's been built. There are open relationships between internationals, Arab believers, Jewish believers. The highway's open. Come travel on it.
Amen.
It's
Maybe
really
it's
amazing.
almost like the new Highway 1 that's been developed in between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem over these last couple of years. They're expanding it. So maybe it's a small kind of couple lanes, but God's plan is to develop this big wide highway where lots of traffic can go on.
Right. But when it's open, then you can get, So
Right.
I'm saying it's open really now. That I feel that verse 23 has basically been fulfilled, not in the widening of the highway, but in the fact that it's open.
It's open.
Anyway.
Yeah,
Let's
that's
look how
good.
that once that gets open, what happens next? Verse 24. Bayomahu yeh Yisrael shlishiya leMitzrayim v'lashor bracha bekerev haaretz. This is an amazing verse, and this is what I feel is, I don't know how to say this. I feel like it's happening right now. And it says, in that day, Israel will be a third to Egypt and to Assyria, a blessing in the midst of the land. Now, what does that mean? First of all, the Hebrew, so it says a third. The third there is not shlishi, but shlishia. Now, if you can hear that, you know enough Hebrew already, that it's not talking about a third thing, but it's one thing made up of 3 parts.
Yes.
It's almost like the Trinity. It's really a trio, a threesome,
Yes.
a one thing with 3 parts. That's an amazing thought that Assyria and Egypt and Israel would become one together. And if you interpret that as Turkey or Iraq and Egypt and Israel, if you interpret that as Sunni and Shiites in Israel, if you talk about as Jews, Arabs, and internationals, as I see it a little bit more, but anyway, they're coming one. And it's amazing we see this happening today of the Jews and the Arabs and the internationals. Of course, it's not a balance in numbers, because the internationals are much bigger than the Arabs are much bigger than the Jews, but the way it comes together, almost artistically, coming into one, I feel it's happening right now. And so we see that when we're having fellowship together. It's not the Jews, it's not the Arabs, it's not the internationals, it's all of us together. And there's a dynamic that it can't happen without one or the other. And there's this give and take, a willingness to honor the other and submit to the other and bless the other. It's a mutual blessing going forth that, look, it would be a simple thing if we weren't talking about 3,500 years of bad history that it's overcoming. And this can only happen through Yeshua, through Jesus, and to see us, and it takes time. And let's say a man and a woman are going to be married. They get to know one another. There's a process, and then they finally get married. They make a covenant, and after the covenant, then they become one. So you can't just become one. You can get to know someone, but you can. And so there's been a process of Jewish believers and Arab believers and internationals getting to know one another. We're actually stepping into that sense of being one family together.
Yeah, that's amazing. Now, another question for you. As this road has been opened, as you're saying, and there's real relationships that are being built, what do you see some of the next steps are in front of us that we still haven't come to?
Yes, well, that's a good. I would actually say I think we're fulfilling this verse right now, and what the next verse is what I think is the next stage where we need to get fulfilled. In other words, I actually think the road was opened about a year ago. Now that was verse 23. Now 24, we're becoming one, and then if we become one, then it's the second half of this verse and the next one. Remember, it says the second half of 24 says bracha b'kerav haaretz. I'll explain that in a minute. It says a blessing in the midst of the earth, and then 25 says Asher berchu Adonai tzvaot lemor baruch ami Mitzrayim maaseh yadai Ashur v'nachlati Yisrael. And it says in that day that Jehovah, the Lord of hosts, is blessing him, saying, "Blessed is my people Egypt, and the work of my hands Assyria, and Israel my inheritance." Well, I was looking at this phrase, Baruch Ami Mitzrayim. I asked some of the Arab believers how you say that in Arabic, and blessed is Baruch in Hebrew, if you can hear that, and it's similar in Hebrew, Mubarak.
In Arabic.
In Arabic is Mubarak, and then Ami, my people, in Arabic is Sha'bi. That's not the same, and then Egypt, which is Mitzrayim in Hebrew, and it's Mesri in it. So the saying in Arabic is Mubarak Sha'bi Mesri, blessed be my people. And so there's two things that I see here. One is the blessing in the midst of the earth, and the other is blessing Egypt, my people. Let's just take 1 minute on each of those. It's really fascinating. The way I'm thinking about this, when he said a blessing in the midst of the whole land, here's how I see it, that Isaiah is prophesying in his time. He's looking at the political situation, looks pretty bad. And then he's thinking backwards to Genesis, to the blessing of Abraham. And he's saying to Abraham, you and your seed will be a blessing to all the nations of the world. And he's saying, how is that going to happen? I mean, all these, Egypt, Israel, Assyria, these are all children of Abraham, physically, and they're fighting, and they're no blessing at all. And he says, wait a minute. I'm in the middle of a political situation that's not working out. I'm looking backward to the promises of God to Abraham. He says it will bless all the nations. And so I received this prophecy that in the future, they're going to be a blessing to everyone.
Wow, that's amazing. That's deep.
And now I see, what a blessed generation. We're the generation where it's happening. Wow. And what I've seen is that, and you've seen that too, whenever we're together as Jewish believers and Arab believers in an international setting, the blessing that is for the internationals. You were asking me about how's it affected. Well, without the internationals are the womb around us that lifts it. I mean, Jews and Arabs couldn't do it together. It's only because the massive prayers from Europeans, Americans, Chinese, Korea, around the world that is lifting us up and then allows us to come together, and then it blesses them back out and blesses. Oh, it's amazing. It kind of bam, 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 multiplies itself exponentially, both internationally with the Arabs and Jews. And so what we're beginning just to taste right now, a little bit of saying, yes, God's promises to Abraham at the beginning, Genesis 12, Isaiah looking at that and saying, despite the bad political situation, it's going to happen. And then in our days, as the believers, international believers, Arab believers, Jewish believers, beginning to come together in that unity, it releases blessing going out to the whole earth.
Wow. Which also that word in Hebrew, aretz, which often is translated land in English, sometimes you could miss that revelation there.
Right,
really,
so it's fantastic.
Going to fill the whole earth as blessing.
Right, so I think that can just go. Actually, I think that's already been released.
Yeah.
Now that just has to multiply. But there's one thing more on this where it says, blesses Egypt, my people. And it speaks about that also of Assyria, the work of my hands. In other words, it speaks as a nation. Now, I'm going to throw this out. This is kind of a deep thing. I just want to get it out there. We don't have time to explain it today. But God has a destiny for each person individually. But he also has a destiny for a nation. Now, you can't really come into your full destiny as a person without coming to know Yeshua. But when a nation also has a destiny, and that destiny of the nation is in the remnant of that nation, the whole group of believers in that nation. But where do they receive their spiritual DNA is their connection to Israel. Because Israel is the only national entity that's described with a destiny, so the remnant pulls it over. So when the Arab believers or international and any nation can see themselves in a positive relationship with Jewish believers in Israel, not just as individuals, but as this is the remnant of our nation, then it starts to bless not only individuals, but blesses the nations together. It brings identity and destiny. Egypt, my people. That's national identity and destiny. Blessed is Egypt, my people. Do you hear that? It's identity and destiny. My people is God's destiny. People, national destiny, blessed, but it goes back and forth. So this is the next stage. When I think that I see we're just out of time. But when the remnant of each nation comes together and has a relationship with the remnant in Israel, we begin to see not just personal destiny and identity, but national. The remnant of each nation representing the national destiny of each nation, and then us coming together in one. And as we come together in one, we're blessing one another, and then the destiny, the identity is revealed, and then boom, the whole earth is blessed. And listen, it sounds just like theory, but what's happening? We're seeing it. Yeah. We're seeing it. We're seeing it happening in these different nations. It's just amazing.
It is amazing. That's awesome. Hey, I just want to take a minute to our friends, you guys that are watching and joining us right now. As Asher's unlocking some of these things, sharing new revelations, a real depth in some of these prophecies, I know that this is probably stirring up a hunger in you to search out more, read more, hear more messages. And I want to encourage you, go to our YouTube channel and on SoundCloud. We have audio messages that we've recorded Asher teaching more in depth on these subjects. He's coming at it from a number of different angles. So go to Revive Israel in YouTube and also SoundCloud, and you'll find more of Asher's teachings on this subject. So Asher, for a final thought, I want to hear just a little bit more as we're sharing this primarily with friends all around the world. What are some practical ways that they can get involved, with what's happening? There can be a sense sometimes where, this is just happening in the Middle East between Jews and Arabs. I'm not either of those. I may be an Asian or North American, or I don't want to just be a spectator. I want to be involved in what God is doing in the Middle East. And what would you say are some practical ways for people to get involved?
Well, the first thing is to understand is that we're not talking about Jews and Arabs. We're talking about Jews and Arabs surrounded by the international community of faith. Believe me, Jews and Arabs could not do this. It's only when the nations raise up the water, they're actually lifting us up. We can't do this. But when the nations are praying and loving us, and they're lifting us up to the place, and so they're, in some ways, the believers from the nations are almost more of an active. We're the passive ones than they are in a certain sense. It's both directions. But first to understand that, and then secondly, to know that there's all kinds of different gatherings. There's local gatherings. We have gatherings with Revive and with Tikkun, alignment with our friends at the Global Gathering, with David Demian, with the Arab. There's different connections, and there are connections. Sometimes electronically, in Zoom calls and in video conferencing, but there's also conferences where people can come together and look for those times when we can be together, build relationships, pray with one another, and have a give and take. And just to be aware, there's that personal interchange, and it's not Jews and Arabs. It's Jews, Arabs, and internationals together that cause this mix. Just as it says in Romans 11, it says that when the ethnos, when the nation groups come to their fullness, the Gentiles, then Israel will be saved. Well, when the nations of the world come to their full participation, then Arabs and Jews can come into their reconciliation, which multiplies the blessing back and forth.
Amen. That's awesome. Well, Asher, thank you so much for sharing what's on your heart today.
Fun.
And thank you guys also for joining us for this week's Revive Live. I want to remind you also that Revive Live is a partnership between Revive Israel and Tikkun International. And we're so glad that you're joining us, and we always would love to hear where you're watching from. We love partnering together with you from all around the world. We bless you, and we'll see you next week on Revive Live.